long before the story ever truly began, before storms or strangers or desperate knocks on the door. There was only the lonely rhythm of Martha Ellison's days. 18 years had crawled by since her husband's death, each season wearing grooves into her soul as deep as the wagon ruts that marked the outskirts of Dry Creek, Wyoming. Here, on the edge of the wild country, she was a fixture, a weathered presence as much a part of the land as the broken fence posts and sagebrush that lined her property. Her ranch house, battered by wind and sun, perched alone on the prairie like a stubborn relic. Peeling paint and warped boards gave it a look of perpetual endurance. Even the porch swing hung crooked, swaying with every gust, as if it still waited for laughter that never came. Martha moved through these days with the practiced grace of someone long accustomed to silence. She mended what needed fixing, drove the cattle out at dawn, and spent her evenings with only the hush of the wind and the memories that haunted the corners of every room. She never spoke of the past, not to anyone who came within earshot. The townsfolk, when they bothered to mention her at all, would say Martha was strange, aloof, maybe even a touch haunted. But they didn't know the truth of her pain, the range war that had stolen her husband, the night the gunfire echoed across the grassland, and how afterward grief twisted inside her so sharply she could barely breathe. Nor did they understand the quiet devastation of her miscarriage, the end of hope, the slow realization that her life would be spent tending to ghosts instead of children. Martha kept her distance, refusing invitations to town picnics or church socials. Content with the company of her battered old dog and the small herd of Herefords she coaxed through each lean winter. Her routine became her refuge. Dawn brought the scrape of boots on cold floorboards, the hiss of coffee boiled black on the stove, and then the patient sorting of chores, feeding the livestock, checking the fencing, patching the barn roof when the wind tore at it like a living thing. By midday, she might pause under the cottonwoods near the creek, letting the hush settle around her, drinking in the vastness of sky and earth. Evenings were hardest. The land would glow gold and then blue, shadows gathering in the folds of the hills. Martha would stand on the porch, a cup in her hands, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. There was a beauty in that quiet, a peace she clung to fiercely, though sometimes her grief would rise without warning. A scent, a scrap of melody, the memory of a child's cry that never was. She would turn away, swallowing tears, pressing on. Wildlife became her only audience. Antelope skirted the fence line, prairie dogs chattered at the edge of her fields, and coyotes sang at night. Sometimes she spoke to them in soft, absent murmurs, her words lost to the wind. It was easier than trying to reach the living. Yet, despite her solitary existence, there was a strength in Martha that refused to be extinguished. It showed in the stubborn line of her jaw, the way she squared her shoulders against the coming storms. On rare trips to town for supplies, she moved through Dry Creek like a shadow. The general store owner, Mrs. Hollis, would watch her with cautious sympathy, always offering a nod and a wordless bag of flour or salt. Children whispered stories about the widow who never smiled, whose eyes saw straight through you. Martha ignored them, focusing on the business at hand, and made sure she was back on her horse before dusk. Seasons turned, and with them, the patterns of her life never seemed to change. But sometimes, the land itself hinted at something waiting, something inevitable. The wind would howl louder, rattling the windows with a fury that felt almost like warning. Thunderheads would gather, stacking high over the plains, and the cattle would bunch close, uneasy. There were nights when the silence pressed in so tight. Even Martha found herself staring at the darkened horizon, heart pounding for reasons she couldn't name. In these years, her only true companion was grief, and even that began to settle into something less jagged, more familiar. She didn't speak of hope, she simply endured. The chores filled her hands, and the ache in her chest became background noise, something as constant as the ticking of the old mantel clock or the distant lowing of the herd. Each day blended into the next, and the world turned indifferent to her suffering. But there were small, secret victories, too. She learned to mend saddles, set broken bones, patch roofs in the dead of winter. She coaxed green shoots from hard soil and taught herself to hunt when her stores ran low. She faced down a hungry bear one spring, standing her ground until it retreated, more out of respect than fear. The land, for all its hardships, became her ally. It taught her patience, resilience, the quiet art of survival. Yet beneath the surface, change simmered. Dry Creek was not as far from the world as it seemed. Rumors drifted in with the stagecoach of lost travelers, desperate men, orphans wandering the high plains. Martha listened, but never let herself hope for company or purpose. Her heart, scarred by loss, was locked behind doors even she had forgotten how to open. So the days spun out, silent and steady, each one a testament to endurance. Martha Ellison, the widow of Dry Creek, carved her existence from the earth and sky, never knowing that the world beyond her fence was gathering, shadows lengthening, stories converging. The storm that would change everything was already rolling in, hidden just beyond the edge of sight, ready to break the silence of all those lonely years. Autumn in Dry Creek could turn brutal overnight, and that year the wind arrived early, howling across the open plains like a thing possessed. The air was sharp, brittle with the promise of snow, and even the cattle seemed uneasy, bunching close to the barn as the sky darkened. Martha Ellison watched the clouds build, stacking heavy and low, their bellies pulsing with blue lightning far out over the hills. She moved through her evening chores with a sense of mounting urgency, double-checking the latches on every gate and layering extra blankets on her horse in the barn. Instinct and experience warned her this storm would not be kind. By sundown, the first icy gusts slammed against the ranch house, setting the windows to rattling and the old tin roof to moaning. Martha laid the fire thick in the stove, every motion careful and deliberate, a ritual learned over endless winters alone. She poured herself a cup of strong coffee and settled at the kitchen table, bracing herself for a night of relentless wind and sleepless hours. But tonight, something was different. Beneath the howling of the storm, another sound pricked her attention. A faint, rhythmic thumping, barely audible at first, then insistent. Martha froze, cup half raised, heart suddenly thumping to match the knocking at her door. Visitors did not come to her ranch, not in good weather, and certainly not in the teeth of a Wyoming gale. She crossed the creaking floor, the boards cold under her boots. At the door, she hesitated, one hand reaching for the heavy revolver she kept tucked just out of sight. Years alone had taught her the dangers of unexpected company, especially at night. Especially with the wind high and wild. Still, something, perhaps an old, stubborn defiance, made her draw the bolt and pull the door open. What she found on her threshold was not what she expected. The porch was crowded with children, 12 of them, huddled close together, their faces pale and pinched with cold, eyes wide and desperate. They wore mismatched coats, some in tatters, boots leaking meltwater, shivering violently in the cutting wind. At their front stood a tall, thin boy, not quite grown but older than the rest, his jaw set, arms thrown protectively around the smallest ones. For a moment, no one spoke. The storm battered the house, swirling flakes into the children's hair and stinging Martha's cheeks. She scanned their faces, a dozen questions crashing through her mind, but the words would not come. The boy at the front cleared his throat, squaring his shoulders in a gesture too old for his years. "Ma'am," he managed, voice raw from cold and fear. "We just need a place to get out of the wind. We'll be gone by morning if you want. I swear it." Martha's mind reeled, her instincts warring with memories she'd spent a lifetime trying to bury. Something in the boy's posture, his refusal to beg, the way he put himself between danger and those smaller than him, reminded her sharply of her husband, years ago, standing up to men twice his size. And the children, their eyes pleading and hollow, struck at the very heart of the ache she carried. The one loss that never healed. She stepped aside, opening the door wider without a word. The children filed in, one by one, moving like shadows. Their boots left puddles on the floorboards, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. Martha stoked the stove higher, pushing aside her own mug and bringing out what little food she had: bread, potatoes, a slab of salt pork she'd been saving for winter. They devoured everything in silence, except for the smallest girl who simply clung to the hem of the oldest boy's coat, too tired to even eat. As the storm lashed the house, Martha moved among them, tending to frostbitten fingers and bruised arms, pouring hot water for tea, gathering what blankets she could spare. She noticed the raw scrapes and fading welts along the children's wrists, the haunted way they flinched at sudden noises. Their silence was heavy, but their gratitude was obvious. Wide, blinking eyes following her every move, small hands reaching for warmth and safety. It was only as the wind died down, hours later, that the oldest boy finally offered his name: Caleb Ryder. He spoke quietly, careful not to wake the little ones now curled like kittens on Martha's braided rugs. They had been walking for days, he said, fleeing a traveling work gang that had treated them worse than animals. He told her how they'd waited until the overseers were drunk and distracted, then slipped away under the cover of darkness, walking with no destination except away. As Martha listened, a fierce and unfamiliar emotion sparked inside her, a protective rage that startled her with its intensity. For years she had managed only her own survival, her own heartache, her own tiny world. But tonight, something shifted. She saw herself not as a woman at the end of her story, but as a guardian on the cusp of something unknown and terribly important. Outside, the storm finally moved off into the hills, leaving the ranch cloaked in silence broken only by the occasional crackle of the stove and the soft, even breathing of sleeping children. Martha sat through the night, rifle close at hand, watching over them as if she had done so all her life. She did not yet know what would come next, only that the loneliness of Dry Creek had been broken forever by a desperate knock in the night, and she would never be the same. Dawn came reluctantly to the Ellison Ranch, the sky a bruised and uncertain gray, still thick with the aftertaste of the storm. The air was sharp and brittle, and a heavy silence blanketed the rooms where the children slept, tangled together in borrowed blankets. Martha moved quietly through the house, stepping lightly over small bodies, the sight of so many young faces at rest stirring something deep and unfamiliar within her. She'd spent years believing she was immune to longing. That time and grief had burned away every softer impulse. Yet now, surrounded by these unexpected guests, she felt herself drawn into their orbit, their presence like a campfire in a landscape long frozen over. Caleb Ryder had not slept. He sat upright near the dying stove, arms folded tight across his chest, blue eyes fixed on the fading embers as if daring them to go out. The weight of responsibility clung to him, far heavier than any 14-year-old should bear. Even in rest, his face was drawn and wary, every muscle poised for flight. Martha recognized that posture. It was the same wary vigilance she'd worn for years, the armor of those who'd been forced to navigate a world that offered no kindness. As the sky brightened, Martha busied herself preparing what little breakfast she could. A pot of thin porridge, a few hard apples from her root cellar, a scrap of leftover bacon crisped in the pan. She set it out on the battered kitchen table, watching as the children slowly woke, rubbing their eyes, stretching stiff limbs, and drifting toward the promise of warmth and food. They ate quietly, glancing at Martha with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope, each child haunted by memories that hovered just behind their eyes. It was only after everyone had eaten that Caleb finally allowed himself to relax, if only a little. Martha poured him a mug of strong coffee, and he accepted it with a grateful nod, the mug shaking slightly in his hands. He stared into the black liquid for a long time before speaking, searching for words, for the courage to trust. He began haltingly, at first barely above a whisper, and then, as the story poured out of him, his voice gained strength, anger and pain threading through every word. He spoke of the work gang, a traveling band of men who roamed the Western territories, scooping up orphans and vagrants, promising food and wages but delivering only cruelty. They moved from town to town, selling the strongest boys to rail crews and the youngest to mines, ranches, or worse. The children were treated like livestock, forced to march for miles, beaten for the smallest infraction, and fed just enough to keep them from collapsing. Caleb had become their leader by necessity. The oldest, the tallest, the one with a spark of defiance the overseers couldn't quite extinguish. He told Martha how he'd watched over the younger ones, bartering away his own meager rations for scraps of medicine when illness swept through the camp, taking the blame for petty thefts to spare the littlest from punishment. He learned to read the moods of their captors, to spot when a beating was coming, to disappear into the shadows when danger grew close. But the situation had grown worse. The rumors came first. Murmurs that the gang's leader, a brutal man named Boone, had struck a deal with a mining camp 2 days' ride north. The youngest children were to be sold off, never to be seen again. Caleb's voice caught when he spoke of the night they escaped. The overseers drunk and brawling over a stolen bottle of whiskey, the children slipping away in pairs, clutching each other's hands in the dark. They moved fast, every nerve on fire, driven not by hope, but by the knowledge that capture meant the end of everything. They walked for days, eating whatever they could scavenge, bitter berries, roots, a stray rabbit caught in a snare. Some of the children were sick, their bodies thin and feverish, but Caleb refused to leave anyone behind. He carried the smallest when their legs gave out, whispered stories to calm the nightmares that came every night, and kept moving, always moving, as if the whole world depended on it. As he finished his story, Martha sat in silence, feeling the chill of his words settle over her like a shroud. She looked at the children, some picking at crumbs, others staring into nothing, and understood, with sudden clarity, that they were balanced on a knife's edge. The world outside her ranch was as cruel and indifferent as ever. If she turned them away, there would be no second chance. For the first time in years, something fierce and unyielding awakened within her. It was the old, wild love she had once felt for her husband, now redirected, reborn as a desperate need to protect. Martha realized her long years of solitude had not diminished her strength. They had prepared her for this moment. She would not fail these children. As the sun broke through the clouds, casting pale gold across the frozen land, Martha made her decision. She would shelter them, teach them, stand between them and whatever darkness came next. She could feel the cost of it already. Trouble would surely follow, and danger was closer than ever. But for the first time in a long time, she felt alive, purposeful, and utterly resolved. The silent years were over. The fight for Dry Creek, for these children, and perhaps for her own redemption, had just begun. The Wyoming sun had barely cleared the ridge when Martha Ellison heard the distant clatter of hooves on frost-hardened earth, a foreign, sharp rhythm slicing through the quiet she'd come to associate with safety. The land outside her window looked peaceful enough, dusted with pale gold where the sunlight met frozen grass. But in her bones, Martha sensed trouble coming. Years alone had honed her instincts, and this morning the world felt too still, as if every living thing was holding its breath. She was out near the barn, checking the herd, when she first caught sight of the stranger, a lone figure on horseback, black hat pulled low, the tail of a duster coat trailing behind like a shadow. The horse moved with the slow, deliberate gait of an animal that had traveled a long distance and knew better than to rush. Martha watched the rider approach, muscles tight, one hand resting against her hip where her husband's old Winchester still hung. The cattle, usually restless at the sight of a stranger, clustered close to her as if sensing the unease in the air. The children, already skittish after days of fear and flight, had taken to their chores in silence. Caleb and two of the older girls were hauling water from the creek, their eyes darting nervously toward the road, while the youngest stayed close to the house. Martha didn't call out or wave. She simply waited, eyes fixed on the approaching figure, every sense attuned to the slightest sign of threat. As the man drew closer, his face came into view, weathered, unshaven, eyes hidden in the shadow of his brim. He rode straight to the fence line, not bothering with greetings or introductions. Even at a distance, Martha recognized the hard, restless energy of a man who'd lived on the edge of violence. There was something about his stillness, the calculated way he sat his horse, that made her spine stiffen. He paused just outside her property, glancing over the spread with a practiced eye. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind picked up, carrying with it the sharp scent of sage and wood smoke. Finally, the man's voice cut through the silence, gravelly and measured. He didn't introduce himself or offer any explanation. He simply asked about runaways, his gaze flickering toward the house and the barn where the children had vanished from view. Martha met his stare, refusing to show fear. Her grip on the Winchester tightened, thumb hovering over the safety, and she stepped forward, placing herself between the stranger and her home. She told him, with quiet certainty, that there were no runaways here. Just a lone woman tending her ranch and minding her own business. Her words carried the weight of unspoken warning, a line in the sand that she dared him to cross. The man's mouth curled in a humorless smile, and he dismounted with slow, deliberate movements, dust swirling around his boots. He leaned against the fence, not trying to push past, but making it clear he wasn't leaving, not yet. He studied Martha, eyes cold and assessing, and for a moment, the air between them crackled with the threat of violence held barely in check. He said his name was Jed Monroe, a bounty hunter as it turned out, with papers authorizing him to collect any runaway property and return it for a fee. Martha's blood ran cold at the term, at the casual way he spoke of children as if they were cattle to be driven back to market. She saw in his eyes that he'd done this sort of work before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Caleb, sensing trouble, moved to Martha's side, his presence a silent show of solidarity. The other children watched from the windows, fear and defiance warring in their expressions. Martha stood her ground, rifle leveled but not yet raised, her voice steely and unwavering as she told Jed he had no business on her land, and that if he tried to search her property, he'd find more resistance than he'd bargained for. The standoff stretched, tense and brittle. The wind whistled through the dry grass, and for a heartbeat, it seemed as though gunfire might split the morning wide open. But Jed, sizing up Martha's resolve, and perhaps calculating the cost of pushing his luck, finally swung back into his saddle, eyes never leaving hers. He offered a parting warning, voice low and flat, promising that others would come, and next time they wouldn't be so polite. Martha watched him go, refusing to relax until he and his horse were nothing but a distant speck on the horizon. Only then did she allow herself a shaky breath, the adrenaline leaving her limbs heavy and her mind racing. She looked at Caleb, who said nothing, but she could see the fear and anger burning in his eyes. She gathered the children close, her resolve hardening with every heartbeat. The world had found them again, darkness in pursuit, and the fragile peace of the ranch was shattered. There would be no more pretending they were safe, no more hoping the storm had passed. From this moment on, Martha knew she would have to fight for every inch of safety these children had found. The next time, there would be no warning knock, only the cold reality of men who trafficked in fear. Inside, Martha locked the doors and checked the rifle. Outside, the wind carried away the last traces of the stranger's presence, but the threat lingered, sharp and undeniable. The true siege of Dry Creek was about to begin. The days after Jed Monroe's visit bled into a raw, relentless winter. Martha Ellison rose before dawn, every morning haunted by the echo of his warning. The threat of more men, more violence pressed down like the heavy sky, and she knew there was no longer any room for comfort or complacency. With the first flakes of snow dusting the pastures, she turned her ranch into a fortress, driven by an urgent purpose that kept fear at bay and brought new energy to her tired bones. She began with the basics, locking windows and doors, hammering boards across any gaps in the barn where a man might hide, stringing wire across the back fence to sound an alarm if cut. With little time and fewer supplies, Martha became resourceful. She enlisted the oldest children, teaching Caleb and two of the bigger boys how to check and reload the rifle, how to hide footprints, how to move quietly after dark. She showed the girls how to wedge a chair under a doorknob, how to build a simple snare in the snow, how to use the root cellar as an escape route if the house was overrun. The children responded to her instructions with solemn, silent focus, as if they understood they had crossed into a different world, a world where their survival depended on cunning and cooperation. Even the youngest learned to move quietly, to hide without crying, to freeze when Martha gave a silent signal. Inside, the mood was tense but purposeful, as if some unspoken pact had formed between them. They would not go down without a fight. As the days shortened and the temperatures dropped, Winter arrived in full force. The wind howled through Dry Creek, dragging curtains of snow across the fields and burying the fences until only the posts remained. The cattle crowded close to the barn, their breath billowing in clouds of steam. Food became precious, every crumb rationed, every scrap of jerky and dry beans counted and measured. The well froze solid for 2 days, forcing Martha and the children to melt pans of snow over the stove for water, their hands reddened and raw from the cold. The blizzard arrived without mercy. It struck in the night, howling around the corners of the ranch house, slamming ice into the windows. Drifts mounted against the doors, trapping them inside for weeks. There was no possibility of leaving for town, no hope of rescue if anything went wrong. The world outside shrank to the 4 walls of the house, the low-ceilinged barn, and the howling dark beyond. Inside, the stove was kept burning day and night. The children slept in shifts, so someone was always awake, listening for footsteps in the snow. Illness crept in like a thief. It started with the youngest, a pale, freckled girl whose cough grew harsher each day, followed quickly by 2 others, feverish and shaking. Martha recognized the signs. Lung fever, common in a Wyoming winter, deadly if ignored. She searched her cupboards, found her herbs nearly gone and medicine in short supply. It was not enough. There was only one option. Martha would have to go to town, storm or no storm. She dressed in layers, wool under her heavy coat, scarf wrapped tight around her face, boots greased and double-socked. She saddled her oldest horse, a stubborn bay named Whiskey, and left strict instructions with Caleb about the rifle and the door. The children watched her from the window, faces pressed to the glass, eyes huge with worry. She told herself she would return. There was no other choice. The ride to town was a nightmare. Snow blinded her, swirling so thick she could barely see the horse's ears. The wind lashed at her face, cutting through every layer until she could not feel her hands. The world shrank to the rhythmic thud of hooves and the ragged sound of her own breath. Branches snapped in the woods beside the trail, unseen shapes moved in the darkness. But Martha pressed on, driven by fear and fury and the memory of all she'd already lost. The main street of Dry Creek was almost deserted when she arrived. White with snow and silent, but for the ringing of the blacksmith's hammer. Martha forced herself to walk upright into the pharmacy, head held high, ignoring the curious stares and whispered questions. She bought what she could, tonics, cough syrup, and fever powder, trading her last bit of silver and promising payment on the rest. The ride back was even harder. Her limbs ached, her vision swam with exhaustion, and twice she nearly slid from the saddle as Whiskey slogged through drifts higher than his knees. By the time she made it home, Martha's face was frostbitten, her hands numb, and the pain in her chest burned like fire. But she staggered inside and forced herself to care for the sick first, mixing medicine, cooling fevered brows, holding trembling hands until the children finally drifted into easier sleep. Only then did she allow herself to rest, crumpling beside the stove as the last of her strength left her. Days passed, and slowly the fever broke. The children, pale and weak, began to smile again. The mood inside the house shifted from fear to relief, a fragile hope blooming in the warmth and safety they had carved out for themselves. The blizzard faded at last, leaving a silent, icy world outside. But within the ranch house, a new sense of family had taken root. A family forged not by blood, but by the fires of survival and the promise that, for now, they were safe together. The ice crusted over Dry Creek for weeks after the blizzard, muffling every footstep and casting the world into a brittle silence. Each day, Martha forced herself through the routines of survival, but the memory of Jed Monroe's visit clung to her thoughts like a shadow. Beneath the sense of relief after the fever broke, worry gnawed at her, a sixth sense telling her that trouble was circling, drawing closer with each sunrise. The children grew stronger, moving about the ranch with a new confidence, yet their laughter felt cautious, as if any loud noise might invite disaster. Then, one morning, as the sky lightened with the faintest tinge of blue and the cold pressed sharp against the windows, Martha stepped out to tend the barn and froze at the sight before her. Nailed to the weathered planks of the barn door, fluttering in the weak wind, was a single piece of blood-spattered paper. The crude drawing scorched itself into her mind, a picture of her ranch house, flames licking from every window, stick figures trapped inside, their faces twisted in terror. For a long moment, Martha simply stared, her breath forming little clouds in the frozen air. Her mind raced. Who had come this close during the night? She scanned the snowy ground, heart pounding, and found what she feared, the tracks of booted feet, at least 3 sets, circling the barn and fading off into the brush toward the north woods. The message was clear and unmistakable. Someone knew the children were here. The warning was not only for Martha, but for everyone under her roof. She tore down the bloody drawing and shoved it deep into the snow, hoping to bury both the paper and the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. But there was no time for shock or panic. She moved quickly through the barn, checking for more signs. Loosened boards, footprints near the back window, anything that might reveal a hidden threat. Her mind replayed every detail of the past days, every stranger glimpsed on the distant road, every shadow near the fence line at dusk. Back in the house, Martha summoned Caleb and the older children, showing them the drawing with a grim set to her mouth. She explained, as simply and calmly as she could, that they were being watched. There would be no more time for ordinary chores or idle play. From this moment, the ranch would run on vigilance and discipline. The doors and windows were to stay locked, even in daylight. Nobody was to stray farther than the barn without permission. At night, shifts would be kept at the upstairs windows, watching for movement, any sign of lanterns or figures in the dark. Caleb took up his new duties with a seriousness that belied his years. He and the other boys patrolled the grounds in pairs, checking every outbuilding, making sure no tracks were left for strangers to follow. The girls kept the house ready for flight at a moment's notice. Blankets and food packed in sacks, water buckets always filled, the rifle loaded and close at hand. The children learned to move through the house with the quiet confidence of survivors, alert to every creak and flicker of shadow. Martha's own nerves grew taut. Nights became the worst, filled with restless hours as the wind moaned around the eaves. Every howl set her heart racing. Every snap of ice on the windows made her reach for her husband's old rifle, knuckles white around the grip. Sleep came only in fits, never fully restful, always interrupted by dreams of fire and the echo of laughter twisted into screams. The land itself seemed to grow hostile, owls calling from the darkness, a coyote's yip in the distance, branches breaking under the weight of snow or something heavier. Each day, the tension ratcheted tighter. The threat did not stay idle. Some evenings, Martha found fresh tracks along the road, cigarette butts pressed into the snow, the imprint of a man's palm on the frost-covered fence rail. One afternoon, Caleb pointed out a distant figure on the ridge, standing perfectly still against the white expanse before vanishing as quickly as he'd appeared. The message could not have been plainer. There would be no rescue, no safe haven outside their own walls. Despite the fear, something unexpected took root among the children. Adversity became a strange kind of glue. The shared danger forced them closer together, dissolving the old boundaries of age and temper. They became quick with a hand on a shoulder, a murmured comfort when nightmares struck, a willingness to share a blanket or split a crust of bread. Even Martha, who had spent so many years locked away in her own sorrow, found herself drawn to the fierce hope growing in their eyes. Their resilience fed her own, reminding her of the reason she fought so hard to protect them. Still, the image from the barn door haunted her. The flames, the promise of violence yet to come. She spent each day preparing for the worst, each night wondering how close the enemy had crept. The world outside was narrowing to a single point of defense, a lone outpost in a wilderness of threat. Yet Martha refused to yield. The ranch, the children, and the fragile sense of safety they'd built together were worth any sacrifice. And as the nights stretched longer, she vowed silently to herself and the cold Wyoming stars. Whatever storm was coming, whatever darkness hunted at the edge of Dry Creek, it would not claim them without a fight. The night the raiders came, the world was darker than Martha Ellison had ever known. Clouds smothered the moon, turning the plains into an endless sea of black, broken only by the sharp, uncertain glow of lantern light inside the ranch house. The air was heavy and silent, so still it felt as though the whole land was waiting for a single, shattering moment. Every instinct inside Martha was alert, every muscle tensed, every breath slow and shallow. The threats, the bloody drawing, the boot prints in the snow, all of it had been leading to this. She could sense it in the way the cattle refused to settle, huddling together and lowing quietly, in the jumpy way the children whispered and glanced toward the windows. That evening, Martha made her rounds for the third time, checking the locks on every window, walking the perimeter with Caleb close at her side. The boys stationed themselves in pairs by the stairs and loft, a battered shotgun ready, eyes wide and serious in the gloom. The girls gathered the younger children in the pantry behind barrels and sacks of flour, whispering quiet reassurances. Every escape route had been rehearsed, every hiding spot prepared. And yet, as the hours dragged on, anxiety coiled tighter and tighter inside the house. Sometime after midnight, it began. The first warning was the low, distant whinny of a horse, then the unmistakable crunch of boots in snow, far too close to the barn for comfort. Martha was already awake, sitting in a kitchen chair with the Winchester across her knees, when the first window pane rattled. She stood, motioning to Caleb to wake the others, and pressed her ear to the cold glass. Voices drifted in, harsh and muffled. Men moving in a line, flanking the house and barn with the silent discipline of those who had done this before. Outside, shadows detached themselves from the tree line, crossing the yard in a hunched, purposeful crawl. The moon finally broke through for a heartbeat, glinting off the barrels of their guns. Martha's heart thudded, but her hands stayed steady. She crept to the barn with Caleb and the oldest boys, taking up position in the loft where they had prepared bundles of hay, ready for a last-ditch defense. The men struck quickly, fanning out to the doors and windows, trying to flush them from their hiding places. The sound of a body slamming against the front door split the silence, followed by a pane of glass shattering at the back of the house. Martha could hear the children's muffled cries, but she forced herself to focus, peering through a crack in the loft boards, as two men kicked open the barn door. One of them carried a lantern, the other a length of rope, and their faces were masked with scarves against the cold. A third man slipped inside, silent as a shadow, heading straight for the stack of hay where little Lucy had been hiding moments before. She was the youngest, barely 11, a wisp of a girl with wild hair and eyes too old for her face. Martha's stomach clenched as she watched the man reach into the darkness, closing a gloved hand around Lucy's wrist. The child struggled, her cry swallowed by the roar of the wind outside. Martha's instincts exploded into action. She gave the signal, and Caleb set fire to the smallest pile of hay, sending smoke billowing through the barn. The sudden confusion caught the men off guard. Martha fired a warning shot through the boards, the echo ricocheting through the rafters, and Caleb loosed a second round, driving one of the men back into the yard. Panic erupted. Horses reared and bucked at the smell of smoke, and shouts rang out as the raiders regrouped. Lucy, terrified but brave, tried to twist free, but the man dragged her toward the door, cursing as the flames spread. Martha pushed through the confusion, leading the older children in a desperate counterattack. They hurled pitchforks, scattered embers, and did everything possible to block the exit. The barn became a chaos of smoke and stumbling figures, punctuated by the crack of gunfire and the wild cries of animals. In the confusion, Lucy disappeared, pulled into the night by the masked man as the others fled under cover of darkness. The air stank of burning hay and gunpowder, the floor littered with dropped rope and discarded lanterns. When the fighting finally subsided, the barn was half ruined but standing, the cattle frightened but alive. The children emerged from their hiding places, coughing and tear-streaked, counting heads in frantic relief, until they realized Lucy was gone. Martha's heart broke at the sight of the empty space where the child should have been. Grief and rage warred inside her, but she forced herself to stay upright, to comfort the others, to show them that hope was not lost. The men had been driven off for now, the ranch scarred but unbowed, yet the cost of their survival was heavy, a wound that throbbed in the heart of the family they had become. As dawn crept over the snowbound plains, painting the land in fragile gold, Martha stood in the ruins of her barn, face streaked with soot and tears, vowing that she would do whatever it took to bring Lucy home. The battle for Dry Creek had become something more, no longer just a fight for survival, but a mission of rescue, justice, and defiance in the face of cruelty. The morning after the raid arrived cold and hollow. The barn stank of smoke, its walls scarred black, the cattle still wild-eyed and restless. But none of it mattered to Martha Ellison. All she could see was the empty space where Lucy had slept. The ache in her chest, already battered by years of grief, felt sharper than ever. As she moved through the wreckage, helping the children clear debris and comfort the frightened animals, Martha's mind spun with grim purpose. She would bring Lucy back, or die trying. Dry Creek awoke slowly that morning, gossip spreading like wildfire. Word of the raid reached the saloon before Martha herself did, carried by a passing ranch hand who'd seen lanterns flickering at the Ellison place before dawn. By midday, Martha had stabled her horse behind the general store and walked straight into the saloon, ignoring the hush that fell as she entered. Her presence, rare, solitary, and marked by the soot and hard set of her jaw, drew wary glances and whispers. She didn't bother with pleasantries, but went directly to the bar, her voice flat as she ordered a whiskey and asked for news of any strangers passing through. Most of the patrons averted their eyes, wanting no trouble, but one woman, Lila, the saloon's owner, met Martha's gaze without flinching. Lila, a survivor in her own right, took in the story at a glance. The bruises on Martha's arms, the raw edge in her voice, the absence of the youngest child. With a nod, Lila gestured Martha into the back room, away from prying ears. There, in the small, dim office behind the bar, Lila spoke quietly. She'd heard talk from the card table the night before. Elias Ward, a powerful rancher known for his money and merciless ways, had recently paid off a group of men and now had new help at his estate out east. It was an open secret among the saloon crowd that Ward had his hands in all manner of ugly business: land grabs, labor trafficking, even rumors of trading children to remote mining camps. Most folks kept their distance, but every now and then a mother would appear in town searching for a lost son or daughter, eyes hollow with worry. Few ever found what they sought. Martha's mind hardened into resolve. She thanked Lila, pressed a coin into her palm, and strode out into the winter sunlight. The plan formed in her mind with the clarity of desperation. She could not ride in openly. Ward's estate was a fortress, watched over by hired guns. But perhaps a lone woman, disguised as a cattle buyer in need of spring stock, might be able to slip past suspicion. Martha traded her battered duster for a new jacket and hat, borrowed from Lila, and sent word through a stable boy offering business at the Ward place. With Caleb and the older children left behind to guard the ranch, Martha set out alone, heart thundering, a borrowed pistol tucked beneath her coat. The ride east was bone-chilling, the snow crunching under hooves, wind biting at her cheeks. As she approached Ward's estate, a sprawling, whitewashed house flanked by outbuildings and a distant corral, she practiced her new role, schooling her features into neutrality, forcing her voice steady when challenged by the men at the gate. The guard, a surly man with a shotgun, barely glanced at her bill of sale before waving her through. Inside, the estate was a world apart. Warmth, light, the smell of rich food drifting from the kitchen. But beneath the polish, Martha sensed rot. She made polite talk, asking after cattle, feigning interest in Ward's herds. As she was shown around, she watched every doorway, noting where the guards lingered, listening for any sign of children. Her gut clenched when she spotted a small, shuttered shed behind the stables, a place out of sight, ignored by most. At the first chance, she slipped away and hurried to the shed, heart in her throat. The lock was old and poorly fastened. Martha pried it open with the knife she carried, easing the door back on silent hinges. The darkness inside stank of straw and fear. There, huddled beneath a threadbare blanket, was Lucy, her face tear-streaked, eyes red but burning with hope at the sight of Martha's silhouette in the doorway. Martha rushed to her, gathering the girl close, murmuring reassurances, though her own hands trembled with relief and fear. Their escape was not quiet. Even as Martha bundled Lucy under her coat, footsteps pounded the frozen ground. Ward's enforcer, a broad man with a scar down his cheek, shouting for help, raising the alarm. Martha drew her pistol, hands steady despite the panic, and fired a warning shot as the man lunged toward her. He fell back, wounded, cursing as Martha yanked Lucy past him and out into the icy yard. Bullets cracked overhead as she and Lucy sprinted for the fence, ducking behind stacks of hay, hearts hammering, boots slipping in the snow. Martha didn't dare look back. She heard Ward's men yelling, the thunder of hooves as they gave chase. Reaching the pasture's edge, Martha lifted Lucy onto the horse and swung up behind her, urging the animal into a wild, reckless gallop across the back fields, snow spraying as they fled into the open country. Behind them, the estate shrank into the haze of falling snow, shouts fading into the roar of wind. Martha pressed Lucy close, every muscle burning with exhaustion and triumph, for now they were free. The fight was far from over, but the first blow had been struck. Martha's defiance had cut through the darkness of Dry Creek, and as the winter sun broke through the clouds, she knew she'd risk it all again for the sake of the children she'd come to call her own. The ride home from Ward's estate was a blur of icy wind and adrenaline. Martha kept Lucy pressed tightly against her, refusing to let fear or fatigue loosen her grip until the ranch house finally crested into view. The children rushed outside as the horse thundered into the yard, tears and laughter breaking loose all at once as Martha slid from the saddle and pulled Lucy into the shelter of the kitchen. For the first time since the attack, a fragile sense of safety returned. Yet Martha understood that victory was only temporary. The world was watching, and trouble, having once found Dry Creek, could find it again. In the days that followed, Martha worked with renewed purpose. The near loss of Lucy and the destruction wrought by the raiders had burned away any last vestige of her old solitude. She was no longer the quiet widow at the edge of town, but something harder, braver, a woman who had looked death in the eye and refused to yield. The children sensed the shift as well. Their loyalty deepened, and their efforts became more than simple obedience. They worked together, driven by pride in what they were building. The news of Martha's stand traveled fast, carried by wagon drivers, gossiping shopkeepers, and a few sympathetic souls in town. Soon, the tale of the widow who defied gunmen and rescued a stolen child began to gather its own gravity. Women from distant homesteads, battered by their own losses, arrived at the ranch's gate, some with children in tow, others with nothing but a battered suitcase and haunted eyes. They had heard that Ellison's place was safe, different, and they came not just for shelter, but for a chance to start anew. Martha welcomed them all. The house, once too big and silent, filled up with the noise of new arrivals. Beds were built in the barn loft, extra pots set to boiling on the stove, and every available blanket pressed into service. The older children, Caleb, Lucy, and the rest, took it upon themselves to guide newcomers, teaching them the routines of defense and the rules that had kept the group alive through the winter's darkest days. Under Martha's careful eye, the farm became more than a refuge. It transformed into a school, a sanctuary, a place where no one's past was held against them and where loyalty was repaid with trust. Defenses grew as steadily as the family did. The perimeter was ringed with fresh barbed wire, and lookouts posted in shifts, rain or shine. Martha and Caleb trained anyone able to hold a rifle to use one, and the girls drilled younger children in how to hide, when to run, and where to find the hidden stashes of food and medicine should the need arise. Evenings became lessons in more peaceful arts, reading for those who had never learned, sewing and mending, the planting of spring vegetables, and the gentle, careful tending of livestock. Each small act of rebuilding was an act of defiance against the world that had tried to break them. For the first time since the range war had stolen her future, Martha found herself laughing again, sometimes in quiet moments on the porch as the children played, sometimes openly, her voice echoing off the hills during a shared meal. The years of silence and bitterness receded, replaced by a new kind of exhaustion, the honest fatigue of a day spent working for something that mattered. There were threats still. Men rode by on the distant ridge, watching the house with calculating eyes. Word came from town of bounty hunters making inquiries, and occasionally a stranger would appear at the gate testing Martha's resolve. But now, she was never alone at the fence line. Caleb stood beside her, taller and surer with every passing month, and a dozen voices answered if anyone tried to challenge her authority. As spring bled into summer, the ranch changed in ways Martha had never imagined. The fields, once sparse and wind-blown, sprouted with vegetables and wildflowers. The barn, blackened by fire, was rebuilt with strong hands and even stronger will. Each new board hammered into place was a promise that Ellison's refuge would endure, that it would stand against whatever darkness came. Orphaned children, abandoned women, and even the occasional wounded drifter found their way there, drawn by the promise of safety and belonging. No one was turned away. Stories spread, some true, some growing in the telling, about the courage found on that patch of hard Wyoming earth. Parents began leaving children at the gate, trusting that Martha's brand of justice was more reliable than the law. The refugee, once a simple ranch, became a legend in its own time. There were growing pains, arguments over chores, the clash of old fears with new hopes, the heartbreak of memories that could not be erased. Yet, with each hardship overcome, the bonds between Martha and her new family only tightened. Even as Martha grew older, lines etching deeper into her face and gray streaking her hair, she found herself surrounded by the kind of love she thought she'd lost forever. The laughter of children, the warmth of a crowded table, the quiet gratitude of those who had nothing left to offer but their loyalty. All these things healed wounds she'd once believed permanent. In the golden light of sunset, with children's laughter floating up from the fields, Martha would pause on the porch and watch her haven come alive. Against all odds, and at the cost of her own solitude, she had built something that mattered. Ellison's refuge stood as a testament to the power of hope, community, and the courage to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. Time moved on, as it always does, but its passing marked the land and its people in ways both subtle and profound. 25 years slipped by, each season carving deeper lines into the earth and the faces of those who remained. Where there had once been the battered ranch of a lonely widow on the edge of Dry Creek, there now stood something remarkable. A sanctuary, a school, a living legacy built from hardship, courage, and stubborn hope. Ellison's refuge, as it was now known far and wide, sprawled across the Wyoming prairie. The main house, once weather-beaten and lonely, had grown, joined by a warren of barns, dormitories, and workshops, all raised by the steady labor of countless hands over the years. Fences ran straight and true, pastures rich with cattle and wildflowers, gardens blooming with vegetables and laughter. The wind, which had once carried only the lonely echo of loss, now rippled through fields alive with children's voices, lessons, and the everyday rhythms of a thriving community. Martha Ellison's portrait hung above the mantel in the main hall, her face captured in oil, strong, unsmiling, eyes clear with the kind of resolve that had weathered storms both literal and otherwise. She had lived to see her vision become reality, but age and hard living eventually slowed her steps and grayed her hair. As she grew older, she became less a figure of authority and more a living legend, a woman everyone looked to for wisdom, comfort, or the occasional stern rebuke. Her presence lingered in every corner of the refuge, from the hand-carved banisters to the worn leather of the old armchair by the fire. The children she had rescued, once thin, hollow-eyed runaways, grew up beneath her roof and, in time, became the guardians of the haven she had built. Caleb Ryder, The determined boy who had led a dozen frightened children to Martha's door that stormy night stood tall now, a man with broad shoulders, a kind but steady gaze, and a deep sense of responsibility inherited from the woman who had saved his life. Lucy, once lost and stolen away, flourished into a bright and capable teacher, her laughter as quick as her wit, beloved by generations of children who never knew hunger or fear the way she once had. Together, Caleb, Lucy, and the others Martha had sheltered returned to the ranch as adults, bringing their own families, skills, and stories. They built new wings to the house, opened classrooms in sunlit rooms, and established rules that honored Martha's blend of justice and mercy. Over the years, hundreds passed through Ellison's refuge, children abandoned, orphaned, or broken by a world that gave them little, and women escaping the old wounds of violence and betrayal. Each one found a place at the table. A cot in a warm room, a chance to heal and learn and belong. The refugee became more than a place to hide from the world. It was a school where boys and girls learned to read, write, and count, where they studied the land, cared for animals, and practiced the old trades: carpentry, blacksmithing, weaving. It was a sanctuary where laughter echoed through the halls and friendships were forged in the glow of lantern light. It was a family, held together not by blood, but by the fierce loyalty and compassion that Martha had shown from the very beginning. Some who left the refuge went on to make their mark in the growing towns of the West. Doctors, ranchers, school teachers, even the occasional lawman. Many returned, compelled by gratitude and love, to give back to the place that had saved them. Each year, on the anniversary of the night Martha opened her door to Caleb and the others, they gathered beneath the old cottonwoods at the edge of the creek. Stories were told, tears shed, and laughter shared. Martha herself, in her later years, would sit quietly in the twilight, listening to the voices rise and fall, the living proof that her choices had mattered. Eventually, the day came when Martha Ellison was laid to rest on a grassy knoll overlooking the fields she had once plowed alone. The funeral drew people from every corner of the territory, old faces, new ones, generations united by gratitude and love. Caleb spoke of Martha's courage, of the stubborn hope she gave to children no one else wanted, of the way she fought for each soul as if it were her own kin. Lucy read the inscription carved into the weathered sign at the gate. "Here, no one stands alone." Those words became the creed of Ellison's refuge, etched into the hearts of all who crossed its threshold. Years passed, but the refuge endured, its purpose undimmed. Children who had once arrived in silence now ran through the meadows, laughter pealing out across the prairie. The adults who guided them remembered their own childhood spent beneath Martha's watchful eye, and worked to ensure that her spirit, unyielding, compassionate, fiercely protective, remained at the heart of everything they did. In the long shadows of sunset, as the sky blazed gold and crimson over Dry Creek, Ellison's refuge stood as a testament to one woman's refusal to let sorrow or cruelty define her life. Instead, Martha Ellison's legacy became a living promise, a place where the lost were found, where the broken became whole, and where every soul who arrived in need discovered a new family, bound together by choice and loyalty for generations yet to come.